Hello, everyone, and thanks to the Los Angeles City Historical Society for inviting me to share some knowledge with you all today, and hopefully, in that sharing of this knowledge, provide you with some inspiration and a little entertainment as well. Um, so, this work has evolved out of my study of Los Angeles African American history. And one of the things that came out of this study was the Angels Walk Heritage Trail, which I wanted to share with you all, is now being installed along Central Avenue. And many of the things that I'm going to talk about today as it relates to the music scene during the Jim Crow era, when the Central Avenue area was the hub of African American life, kind of have it's not kind of, they are reflected in some of the stanchions that are put on the street. There's 15 stanchions that will be eventually put on the street. There's only a couple of them up right now, and we're excited about that project. And we hope that you'll be able to participate in taking a walk over there sometime soon. Okay, so the Great Migration, with its beginnings in around 1910, was part of the waves of people of African American ancestry who migrated to Los Angeles from who migrated to Los Angeles to form an influential community that helped to shape the character of the growing metropolis, California, and the West, starting with the Spanish colonial settlement of the state and the founding of the city in 1781. For many of the newcomers from the past to the present, Southern California's temperate climate, strikingly beautiful natural surroundings, economic opportunities, and social freedoms have provided a better quality of life than the places the migrants left behind. As the first wave of the Great Migration around the nation was emerging, the influence of Los Angeles African American of the Los Angeles African American community during this time reached beyond the city itself to the state and the nation. As early as 1910, the city became the center of the African American population in California and the West, surpassing San Francisco and Oakland. Most Black migrants moved from southern states to Los Angeles to escape the worst of Jim Crow discrimination and segregation. An early symbol of Black progress was the election of Frederick Madison Roberts in 1918 as the first African American member of the California State Assembly, representing a multi-ethnic district in Los Angeles that eventually stretched from East 9th Street 3 miles south to Slauson Avenue. His assembly district included the Central Avenue corridor, where most African Americans in the region would live until the post-World War II decades. In this period, a vibrant African American community formed and flourished into the 1950s south of downtown in this area, which was then called the East Side because it was east of Main Street. By the mid 1920s, Los Angeles had the largest Black population, and its importance increased as an African American urban center for life, politics, as an African American urban center in the life and politics and business of this community. This inventiveness contributed to defining the place for Black Los Angeles and promoted the Southern California metropolis as a place of opportunity for this community. These early 20th century African American migrants paved the way for all their community members and some other marginalized groups who moved to the region into the World War II years and its aftermath. The African American population multiplied dramatically from 1900 to 1930, as did the general population in the City of Angels. In the East Side Central Avenue district, where at that time, while whites made up, excuse me, in the East Side Central Avenue districts, where at that time, while whites made up the majority, the number of ethnic Mexicans and Japanese equaled those of African Americans. Culturally and politically, Black Angelenos prominently placed their stamp on the district by the mid-1920s. As they found it difficult to settle in other parts of the city due to racist, restrictive land deed clauses and other discriminatory practices, the district became the center of economic and cultural life for Black Angelenos and emerged as a key location in the national civil rights movement. The area would remain the place where most African Americans began life into the post-World War II decades, where they bought homes, raised families, and diligently labored, established and ran businesses, built social and faith institutions, and cultivated a cultural life that included live theater, nightclubs, and the emergence of West Coast jazz. Many have forgotten that Los Angeles and San Francisco had a very important place in the early history of jazz alongside New Orleans, Chicago, Kansas City, and New York. Jazz did not migrate from New Orleans to Chicago. The music evolved in several urban centers at the same time, most recognizably in the second decade of the 20th century. The word jazz first appeared in print in a California newspaper in 1913. The word has been linked with a style of dance, or with the word has been linked with a style of dance and sometimes sex. Los Angeles played a pivotal role in the development and popularization of jazz music, beginning with its use in Hollywood films. It was performed in California nightclubs, and all of this spread it around the world. The early 20th century, in the early 20th century, ballroom dancing and the motion picture industry's growth, alongside the growth of the African American community in Los Angeles, helped to make this community famous nationwide for Black music genres, particularly jazz. This distinct musical community was ironically enhanced by the widespread discrimination and increasing residential segregation in Los Angeles by the 1920s. Black musicians denied employment in most entertainment establishments were nurtured by African American operated religious institutions, social organizations, nightclubs that would make Central Avenue a famous mecca for the music. From the 1920s to the 1950s, along Central Avenue, from Little Tokyo to Watts, nightclubs dotted the landscape. Brothers and accomplished multiple instrumentalists, jazz musicians, John Curry, Johnny Spike, and his brother and his brother Benjamin Reb Spikes, I'm sorry, it's Spikes with an S, moved to Los Angeles with their parents from Dallas, Texas in the late 1890s. As young men, they played in minstrel shows and the mining camps of the West and Midwest. In her early years as an entertainer, Hattie McDaniels was featured in the Spikes Brothers shows around the West. Around 1919, the brothers opened the first African-American owned music store in Los Angeles at 12th Street and Central Avenue, where they sold sheet music, musical instruments, records to black, white, and Mexican and gypsy musicians and the general public. Their store was the only place at the time where one could purchase recordings by African-American musicians. A hugely profitable venture, the store became a hangout spot and rehearsal hall for Central Avenue musicians into the early 1920s. The brothers also handled band bookings, wrote arrangements, and published music. They helped build the early jazz music scene in Los Angeles, along with pianist Ferdinand Jelly Roll Morton, the self-proclaimed innovator, the self-proclaimed inventor of jazz. They brought him to the West Coast in 1917. Morton ran shows at the Cadillac Club at 5th and Central Avenue in downtown Los Angeles. He and the Spikes brothers ran influential clubs in the early jazz scene, including the Dreamland, Rebs Club, and the West Side Park Cafe. The nightclubs and the store run by the brothers and the clubs run by others, such as the Quality and Hummingbird Cafes near the Avenue, as Central was called, attracted whites visiting from Hollywood to buy records by Black musicians and for titillating evening outings. The brothers' band of African-American musicians in 1921 was the first to play on local radio and to make a record for a movie studio. They played with Kid Ory's Creole. They played with Kid Ory's Creole Creole Orchestra under the name Spike's 7 Pods of Pepper, making the first commercial jazz record by a Black New Orleans band. The brothers composed the song Someday Sweetheart, which Jelly Roll Morton recorded. With Morton, they wrote Wolverine Blues and Foggy Moore Rag. They did records with reedman Les Height and drummer Lionel Hampton that included the songs Steppin' High, My Mama's Blues, and Shetfield Blues. This last song was about a local African-American police officer named Maceo B. Shetfield, who was involved in aggressive policing actions. After quitting law enforcement, Shetfield later became an actor. As the jazz music's influence was growing during these early decades of the 20th century, several important African-American owned businesses were established and prominent buildings were constructed on or not far from Central Avenue. The largest businesses included the Blodgett Motor Company, the Golden State Mutual Life Insurance Company, Liberty Building and Loan Association, Angela's Funeral Home, and the Dunbar Hospital. Each constructed new buildings for their businesses by the beginning of the 1930s. Other prominent buildings constructed included Second Baptist Church, the 28th Street YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, the Elks Club, and a Los Angeles Public Library branch. The Lincoln Theater opened at 23rd and Central in 1926, offering spectacular stage shows to packed African-American audiences on Saturday and Sunday nights. The Moorish Revival Architecture building quickly garnered the nickname the West Coast Apollo. the Lincoln presented many of the famous acts as Harlem's famed Apollo Theater. The Lincoln's opening featured Curtis Mosby's Dixieland Blues Blower Orchestra and the silent movie Rose of the Golden West, starring Mary Astor and Gilbert Rowland. Throughout its 35-year run, the Lincoln offered motion pictures and stage shows, talent shows, and vaudeville. It was among the West Coast's first theaters for African Americans who were barred from the movie palaces or relegated to colored-only seating sections in downtown Los Angeles. Bardu Ali, a New Orleans jazz and R&B singer, was the Lincoln's master of ceremonies and performed with his band. Every performer of note appeared there. Count Basie, Lionel Hampton, Duke Ellington, Bill Bojangles Robinson, Nat King Cole, Billie Holiday, Fats Domino, Sammy Davis Jr., and B.B. King. Pigmeat Markham, a stand-up comedian, also performed there in blackface. The Lincoln attracted white patrons as well as black. In 1928, the Los Angeles Times, a Los Angeles Times columnist wrote that many white people crowded in too, because the chance to see Negro actors of real ability appearing for their own people rather than appearing as Negroes for the white man, from the white man's point of view, is one that that doesn't come to one in every city, unquote. The theater's house company, known as the Lafayette Players, put on dramatic and comedy productions. The 1920s also offered the promise of African-American resort and residential real estate development projects on a grand scale, which attempted to capitalize on the growth of Los Angeles and its environs that drew worldwide attention in Torrance, Manhattan Beach, Santa Monica, and Val Verde in Los Angeles County, Huntington Beach in Orange County, and Corona and Lake Elsinore in Riverside County. Even with the challenges these projects ultimately faced, these symbols of upward mobility captured the attention of African Americans contemplating business opportunities for Blacks in the West and provided inspiration to entrepreneurs within the local Black community. Sometimes popular bands were used to draw, sometimes popular bands were used as draws to entice people to visit and buy property at these places. And you can learn more about these places when you read my book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. Musician, composer, and record company impresario Leon Rene and his relatives spent a lot of time at Lake Elsinore. The Rene clan in 1922 moved from Covington, Louisiana to the Los Angeles environs. In the 1920s, Leon led his jazz group, the Southern Syncopators Orchestra, as a songwriter, pianist, and singer. His older brother, Otis J. Rene Jr., was a pharmacist at 13th Street and Central Avenue, and also a member of the band. For several decades, the two brothers wrote songs individually and together and produced them for musical theater, Hollywood films, and jazz, rhythm and blues, and rock and roll artists. Some of the songs became very popular. Louis Armstrong made their When It's Sleepy Time Down South, also written with Clarence Muse, his anthem when he recorded it several times during his long career. Leon Rene wrote When the Swallows Come Back to Capistrano, which became a standard with recording standard with recordings by the Ink Spots, the Glenn Miller Orchestra, Bing Crosby, Pat Boone, and other artists. The song's popularity captivated the song's popularity captivated people uh, um, and elevated the little Southern California town and its old Spanish mission into a much higher profile place in popular culture and more significance in popular memory. One of Leon Rene's best-selling songs was Rocket Robin, the first recorded by Bobby Day in 1958, and then later by Michael Jackson of the Jackson 5 in 1972, and more than 50 other artists. On the West Coast, the Rene brothers were also pioneering record company owners, opening a few of the first independent record companies, Exclusive Records and Excelsior Records in the 1940s, and Class Records in the 1950s. They recorded early rhythm and blues and rock and roll hits with innovators such as the Nat King Cole Trio, Ivy Anderson, Herb Jeffries, the Johnny Otis Orchestra, Preston Love, Joe Turner, Johnny Moore's Three Blazers, Joe Liggins, Richard Berry, the Charles Mingus Band, and numerous other artists. Back to the Avenue, the Hotel Somerville later renamed the Dunbar Hotel at 41st Street, which was changed to 42nd Place to line up with the streets in the western part of the city around 1940, and Central Avenue was built in part to host the 1928 National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's annual meeting, the organization's first on the Pacific Rim. This Western meeting location signaled the regions and particularly Los Angeles had moved into the national civil rights mainstream. Today, this place and several area buildings in the Central Avenue district are listed as significant sites on the National Register of Historic Places for regional and national history. As the Dunbar, the hotel was also listed in the African American Traveler Guide, the Green Book, from the 1940s to 1956. The dentist and husband and wife business and civic activist team of John and Veda Somerville built the hotel that was initially named for them. All observers identified it as a beautiful hotel, with the Eagle calling it a monument to Negro enterprise. Originally, this 4-story brick hotel, designed with Spanish-style elements, featured a courtyard, a drugstore, a barber and beauty shops, a dining room, a piano lounge, a bandstand, and a first level that was 2 stories high. A walled perimeter mezzanine overlooked the exposed lobby, which featured steel grade work and murals with Southwestern themes. The lobby became a hip meeting place for Black America's elite, and the neighborhood emerged as the heart of the African American community in Los Angeles. The hotel spurred development And the hotel spurred development and flourished along with several jazz clubs, including the Club Congo, Club Alabama, The Last Word, The Downbeat, Club Memo, and Ivy's Chicken Shack, along with dozens of small restaurants and bars in the area. The hotel was a source of tremendous pride on Central Avenue, and, and the area became known by some as Little Harlem or Brown Broadway. Under the new ownership in 1931, the now called Dunbar Hotel obtained a cabaret license to open a nightclub. These new additions ushered in the 1930s to the 1940s era heyday of the place being known as the hub of Los Angeles Black life, the epicenter of the Central Avenue jazz scene, and an important gathering place for notable figures of intellectuals, community leaders, and activists, artists, athletes, and others. The hotel was the place where Black entertainers could comfortably stay after they performed in white hotels where they were not welcome to stay. Many prominent musicians stayed or performed at the Dunbar, including Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Cab Calloway, Lena Horne, as well as Red Fox, Count Basie, Stephen Fetchit, Eddie Rochester Anderson, and Bill Bojangles Robinson. In addition to NAACP leaders W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson, other historical notable guests included Langston Hughes, Jack Johnson and Joe Louis, the boxers, Paul Robeson and Marian Anderson, famous singers, Josephine Baker, a singer and performer and social activist, Thurgood Marshall, legendary civil rights lawyer and first African-American Supreme Court judge, Ralph Bunche, who grew up in the neighborhood, who became a diplomat and won a Nobel Peace Prize, Oscar Dupree, a congressman from Chicago, Arthur B. Spingarn, a founder of the NAACP, Roy Wilkins, who was a leader of the NAAC, to name just a few. The unofficial town hall and country club of Black Los Angeles also hosted important discussions and planning for improving community members' lifestyle between people like the ones I've already mentioned, along with doctors and lawyers, educators, and other professionals. Art exhibits and political events were held at the hotel. Drawn by the music and vibe when Central Avenue was at its peak of chic, the Dunbar was also a popular hangout spot for many white Angelenos, such as W.C. Fields and Bing Crosby. Mae West, James Cagney, and George Raff and Clark Gable were said to have also visited the Dunbar or the Club Alabama. The Great Depression upended stability and upward mobility for many people, not only African Americans. The Black community had the additional challenges of dealing with the racist restrictive covenants in housing and discrimination in housing, as well as discrimination and exclusion in many public places, and police brutality. Even with these challenges, housing and educational opportunities in Los Angeles were much better for African Americans than in other major U.S. cities. Lack of employment opportunities due to racial discrimination continued to be a barrier to economic mobility and prosperity for African Americans in Los Angeles and across the US. There was still a continuation of the earlier musical activity, including concerts in churches as well as music in theaters and nightclubs. During the Depression, the Work Progress Administration funded many Central Avenue community musicians and choral performances, as well as musical instruction and dance socials in different community youth programs. Some of the notable instrumentalists and singers who grew out of this era are Sonny Criss, Dexter Gordon, Chico Hamilton, and the saxophone player Vi Red, whose father was a influential, whose father was Alton Red, who was an influential, he was a musical influence on her, and he also was a leading figure in the Central Avenue jazz scene. Other notable musicians and vocalists were Melba Liston, Big J McNeely, Clarence McDonald, Elsa Smith, William Grant Steele, and A.C. Bilbrew. Some of the legendary Los Angeles African American musical instructors of the era included Alma Hightower, John Gray, Thomas LeBlanc, and Sam Brown. The second wave of the Great Migration, beginning in the 1940s, coincided with World War II's transformation of the economic and social landscape of Los Angeles citizens in general, and African Americans in particular, as new employment opportunities eventually became available. African Americans continued to migrate to California in greater numbers than the general population, and Los Angeles persisted as their largest population center in the West. In the 1940s, nightlife was available 7 nights a week. The demand for African American music continued at the clubs, along with social dances at places like the Elks Club at 34th and Central, the Masonic Hall and the Masonic Hall at 52nd and Central. Black bands also played at the YMCA on 28th Street, a few blocks from Central at Naomi Street. Some popular artists in this era, when big bands were disbanding, included Little Esther Phillips, the Coasters, Roy Milton, Les McCann, Sam Cooke, Oscar Peterson, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Hampton Hawes, and Jimmy Witherspoon, just to name a few. Even while jazz music was exploding, there was a slow decline beginning on the Avenue in the late 1940s. In the 1930s to 40s, African Americans continued to face overt white resistance and threats of violence that limited their residential mobility, while Los Angeles' Black middle-class citizens led the nation in initiating lawsuits to eliminate racist restrictive covenants into the 1940s. The Black middle class began to move out of the area even before the 1948 Supreme Court case, Shelley versus Kramer decision, unfolded that made racially restrictive covenants on property deeds unconstitutional. Successful efforts to combat discrimination and segregation in housing, accommodations, and schooling opened new opportunities in other parts of the city. Fewer investments were made in the Central Avenue district, and the area had newfound competition. African Americans could go to new places not previously available to them. Whites could see Black musicians at other places around the city. The jazz club scene moved west from the jazz club scene moved west with the African American middle class to Western Avenue and the Crenshaw district around the 1950s, with a few, like the Parisian Room, moving further west to La Brea Avenue and Washington Boulevard. Dollar circulation for Central Avenue went to other places. The flamboyant and very entertaining pianist and vocalist Dorothy Donegan, who was married to John McClain, who owned a nightclub on Western Avenue, became popular locally and beyond, as did trumpeter and drummer Cora Bryant. Rhythm and blues music also became popular, and new clubs sprang up in other parts of the city offering the new music. Music impresario John Grayton Dalton opened his famous record store, Dolphins of Hollywood, in Los Angeles's Vernon Central neighborhood in 1948. His store and other music industry endeavors prompted the then new dance music genre called R&B, or rhythm and blues, which was and R&B was the abbreviation. So his store and other music industry endeavors prompted this new dance music, R&B, which was a blend of African American music styles like swing and boogie woogie and jump blues with gospel and urban blues elements. In Southern California, the 1950s R&B music and dance scene culture was deemed subversive by law enforcement. For the first time, a popular cultural scene brought unprecedented numbers of young people together from white, Black, and brown communities in social dancing situations. On weekend nights after the bars and nightclubs closed, Dolphin store and the neighborhood barbecue restaurants would be packed. By 1954, under Chief William H. Parker, the police began to pursue a puritanical crusade against race mixing and inner city vice by shutting down these late night businesses and chasing white people away. Dolphin gathered a petition of 150 Black business people from the neighborhood protesting these tactics of intimidation and terror directed at interracial trade. As the use of the jukebox and DJs rose, there was less interest in jazz and live band performances that had been a mainstay of the Avenue nightlife. Other communities of color, along with the last remaining whites, also moved to other neighborhoods and suburbs in the 1950s and 1960s. Generations of Mexican Americans and new Mexican immigrants, and later people from Central and South America, moved into the South Central Avenue district. By 2009, these groups made up 75% of the community that occupied the historic Central Avenue district from downtown to Slauson. The legacy of the legacy of the history of jazz and Central Avenue, when it was the hub of African American life, continues to strongly inspire Americans and global culture in the music of rock and roll, rhythm and blues, and hip hop and rap. Remember, in the future, you can attend the annual Central Avenue Jazz Festival every July. And if it's not live coming up, it'll be virtual, where you can enjoy and celebrate West Coast jazz and see how the Avenue's past continues shaping Los Angeles and global culture. You can also stroll the Angels Walk Central Avenue trail and look at the stanchions that are being installed now, as I mentioned. And in doing this, you will learn about the historical African American actors who built community with their peer, who built community and sought self-determination. They did all of this while resisting racist, anti-Black restrictions and oppression as they also enjoyed themselves. You'll get a bit of exercise and gain, I hope, much inspiration from these American stories. Thank you very much. And we'll take a few questions if we have them. See one question from Anna Brooks asking, where are the stanchions located on Central Avenue? They're from 23rd down to a couple of blocks south of Vernon. The last one on the south side is, near the public library there, the Washington branch. And the first one is up by the Lincoln Theater. And then they're spaced, I think it's like about 1.5 miles, and they're spaced about evenly, 15 stanchions from 23rd all the way down to, I forget what street that is, but I want to say it's like 52nd, something like that. And then let's see, was there jazz in Manhattan Beach before the area was condemned? From Desiree. So in terms of Manhattan Beach, it's very possible that at different times with the Bruce's Lodge there, where the African American community was, I mean, I know that they had parties down there where bands played. So yes, that was part of some of the activity that went on down there, but it was not like a resort community where you had a lot of businesses that were there. It was only the one business, which was the Bruce's Lodge. The area became known as Bruce's Beach because the lodge was there, and that was like the foundation of why people would go there, and also the small residential second home community of people that grew up around there did so because the Bruce's Lodge was there. Okay, somebody says, I remember hearing about there being a jazz hotspot in San Pedro. Do you know anything about this? No, I don't. I'm sure that there was, but I don't have information on that. Okay, so somebody's asking, how did newspapers play a role in publicizing? This is Andrea Talbot. And hi, Andrea. I know her. How did the newspapers publicize? What role did the newspapers play in publicizing musicians and artists on Central Avenue, either in the Black or white papers? Oh, they were instrumental, because you have to remember, in the early part of the 20th century, that was the medium, the print medium in terms of advertising. The telephone was just coming into play at that point in time. So it would have been, in terms of advertising, the newspapers, handbills, possibly, and you know, small things that would be posted in different places, and word of mouth. So yes, newspapers were very instrumental in advertising the different performances. I remember someone, Charlie Mims, hi Charlie, a member of the Los Angeles City Historical Society. I remember going to the Lighthouse in Hermosa Beach in the 1960s to listen to jazz. They featured Black musicians then. Yeah. I did have a chance myself to go to the lighthouse. It would have been in the 80s. It was still open then. It got messed up a few times because of storms when the pier got, or maybe that's the wrong place. There were two jazz clubs down there. I know there was one on the pier. That would have been in Redondo, but Hermosa Beach, it's on one of the streets in Hermosa Beach. And I did go there once. Okay, Desiree, when did the area stop being the jazz hotspot? So it stopped in the early 1950s in terms of Central Avenue being the hub of Black life and music. The African American middle class moved west, and the racially restrictive covenants had been made unconstitutional, and people were moving out of the area, and the jazz scene moved west to Western, as I mentioned, and to the Crenshaw district. Okay, Colleen Fildner. I'm writing a book about old California, and I would like to include stories about African Americans in Los Angeles before 1900s. For example, I wrote Biddy Mason's story. Any other suggestions? If you want to contact me offline, I'm available at my website with my email. You can contact me and I'll share some resources with you. There's a few books, but there's not really a lot of books on this topic of African Americans in the 19th century, but there are a few.
How many Southern Blacks moved to LA as opposed to New York and Chicago?
So the numbers were smaller, but as it relates to, and I don't have those population figures off the top of my head. The numbers weren't as large in terms of African Americans moving to New York and to Chicago, but there was a significant population that moved here. And in terms of Los Angeles, the area became the hub of Black life in the West and the largest population center of African Americans. And it still is today. Southern California has the largest number of African Americans in the West. Somebody's asking me about what happened to Mamie Clayton's library and collection. That collection is now at Cal State University, Dominguez Hills. And so I guess it's being processed, and then at some point in the not too distant future, it'll be made available to folks to be able to look at. Process means that they're making sure that they have cataloged everything so that they can make it available to the public. Somebody said, yeah, somebody said, I think there were African Americans with the California Spanish expedition. Yes, there were. There were several waves of African ancestry who migrated to Los Angeles as I mentioned, from the founding of California. From the founding of the Spanish settlement in the late 18th century into the 20th century. And then African Americans came with the Americans in the 1840s for the most part. There were a few African Americans before that time, but the larger numbers, which was still small, there were less than 60 African Americans in Los Angeles by 1860. Someone's asking me to repeat my book title. My book is called Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. And the book is available at your preferred booksellers. But if you would like an autographed copy, you can contact me at my website and buy one from me, and I'll mail it to you. Someone's asking again, I don't know when all the stanchions will be put on the street. we've had a 3-year construction review delay construction review delay that has inhibited the stanchions from being put on the street. And they now have just started installing them in the last month and a half. And so hopefully sometime soon, they will all be on the street. And so soon, within the year, I don't know what to say. We thought that they would be installed by now, but there's only a couple of them on the street right now. And I was told that yesterday because Angels Walk knew I was doing this talk today and that I was going to mention the walk. So stay tuned. You can go to the Angels Walk LA website and you can get updates on the installation. And you can also now see the walking book guide. So you can see the information abbreviated about the stanchions. And then there's other information about contemporary businesses and other people, places, and events of the time period of the walk that are mentioned in the book to give you some local color as you're strolling down the street between each of the stanchions.